Thank you, Convener. Can I address the issue of the letter dated the 9th of December 2016 from Derek Penman, Chief Inspector of Constabulary, to Andrew Flanagan, the Chair of the Board, in which he makes quite a number of very substantive points about the governance of the SPA. Can I first of all ask, this letter was dated the 9th of December. When was it circulated to the Board?
I don't think it has been circulated to the Board.
It hasn't been circulated to the Board?
No.
This is a letter from the Chief Inspector of Constabulary about the governance of the SPA, making very substantial points. And he specifically says, I accept it will be properly a matter for the Board to approve the corporate governance framework, but my comments are intended solely to inform members of the Board ahead of their decision next week, 5 days after this letter was sent. Why was it not circulated to the Board?
I think because the issues themselves had been well trailed, they had been well known. Derek's position on these matters had been expressed with members of the Board, so it was known. So I didn't think that it was necessary to circulate the letter itself.
Well, it's not within your remit to make a decision like that. Every board member, under the guidelines and under statute, is entitled to know what the Chief Inspector of Constabulary is saying. These are very substantive points, very critical of the governance review in many respects. Surely to goodness this should have gone to every board member before that meeting in December.
As I said, the comments that he was expressing, the board members were already aware of. At our meeting on the 5th of December, this had been discussed, and a number of these things had been covered at that point.
Well, I find that very unacceptable indeed. I think it breaches every rule in the book about the role of a chair, particularly of a public organisation, and about the issuance of letters to board members. Every board member should have had a copy of that letter, and it should have been discussed at that December board meeting. This is not the Kremlin you're running. It's supposed to be an open public body, accountable. You're accountable to the board members. The Chief Inspector, who has responsibility for these matters, his statutory responsibility, his view should have been, in this letter, should clearly have been sent to every board member.
The letter was addressed to me, and I believed that the matters had already been covered by the board and they were aware of them.
Well, it was addressed to you, but he specifically said he wanted the letter very clearly to go to every board member, because he specifically says the letter is to inform board members at their meeting next week before they reach any decisions, and you took a unilateral decision not to circulate that to board members.
Yes, I did. As I said, the contents of it were well known to the board members.
Well, that's not the point. The letter should have been circulated. Did Mr Foley know that it wasn't being circulated to the board members? Did you see the letter?
I don't recall seeing it at that particular point in time.
So the Chief Executive didn't see the letter either?
Well, I may have seen it. I don't recall it.
You may have seen it. Yes. I mean, this is a very important letter, Mr Foley.
Yes,
this is from the Chief Inspector of Constabulary.
Yeah,
you either saw the letter or you didn't see the letter before the board meeting. Are you telling us yes or no? Did you see the letter before the board meeting?
I'm telling you, Mr Neil, I don't recall seeing it.
Could you check out? And
what I do recall is having conversations with Mr Penman around that time, and him expressing his views to me quite clearly, and having seen the letter and read it over recent days, that is in accord with a conversation that I had at the time where Mr Penman expressed his views.
So you've only seen this letter in recent days?
No, I don't recall seeing it at that point in time. I may have done. There are a large number of letters that come through the office. I just don't recall seeing that one.
I'll be honest, I find it hard to believe that the Chief Executive of the SPA, given the 3 years of failure at the SPA, did not recall seeing a letter of this importance with these contents, and you don't recall whether you saw it or not.
I can't
and
tell
you're
you,
the Chief Executive, the accounting officer.
I can't tell you, Mr Neil, that I did if I don't recall it, and I don't recall it.
Well, presumably every time you get a letter, it's date-stamped when you receive it. Yes?
They usually come in via email. This letter is not addressed to me. What I'm saying is that I may have seen it in a copy. It might have been sent to me. I don't know.
Right.
I don't recall it. Well, but I didn't see an original letter that came in at that time addressed to the chair.
Right. So the Chief Executive didn't see the letter, doesn't recall seeing the letter. Can I ask Paul Johnson, when did you become aware of this letter, Paul?
Again, I cannot give a specific date as to when I was aware of the letter. I have discussions with Derek Penman as Chief Inspector of Constabulary, and I've certainly been aware of some of the concerns that he has had, and aware of the issues that he has raised with the SPA, and indeed, of course, he's shortly undertaking a full inspection that will cover these matters. Don may wish to say more about the sequencing of when Scottish Government received particular pieces of document.
I saw the letter at the time. The Scottish Government received the letter at the time. We received it as a courtesy side copy and hard copy from Derek on an informal basis. It was passed to me very informally as a hard copy.
And from this morning's Herald that the Scottish Government gets a copy of all the board papers before the board meeting. Yeah?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Generally, yes.
Generally. So you would have picked up that this wasn't in the board papers?
Yes, we would have been aware of that at the time.
So did you not perhaps mention to Mr Foley or Mr Flanagan that maybe this is clearly intended for every board member on the SPA? So did you draw it to their attention that it hadn't been circulated?
I think we would have regarded that as a matter for the chair.
You would regard that as a matter for the chair?
Yes.
So you've got an SPA under attack, as it has been rightly for the last 3 years, for incompetence after incompetence after incompetence, trying to cover up, having forced a board member to resign, it would appear, and you didn't think it was important that this letter from the Chief Inspector wasn't circulated to board members?
I'm quite clear that the decision on papers that go to the board of the SPA is a matter for the chair.
The decision is, but you in your role as head of police in the Scottish Government, did you not draw it to the attention that this clearly states it should go to board members? You clearly knew it wasn't going to board members because you get the board papers, but you didn't think it was wise maybe to speak to Mr Flanagan or Mr Foley to say, do you not think it would be wise to make sure this goes to board members? A letter of this importance and with these contents.
Again, I wouldn't have seen that as the role of government at the time. I would have seen that as the role of the chair.
So why do you get the board papers then?
We get the board papers for information primarily. It's simply to make the government aware of issues that are coming up at the board.
And you never comment to the board or the chair or the chief executive on the board papers before they go to the board?
We occasionally make comments on the papers, but it's usually on matters of factual accuracy more than anything else, I would suggest.
Right. But nobody thought in the civil service that maybe, given the controversies, that it might be a good thing for the Chief Inspector's letter to go to board members? Nobody thought to mention that?
Again, it's I would see it as the difference in the functions between the government and the body, and I'm pretty clear that in terms of the governance framework that we have between the government and the body, that it is the chair and the chief executive's decision in terms of what papers go to the board.
It's very clear in the rules that a letter like this has to go to board members, specifically when it's from the chief inspector asking it for it to go to board members, and nobody thought to make sure that the rules were kept to. Anyway, we'll move on to the contents of the letter. Can I just go through some of the contents, convener? In the second paragraph, he says, Derek Penman, the Chief Inspector, says, I understand that the framework has been discussed in private session with members and will be formally agreed at next week's board meeting. Why are these things only discussed in private session and then formally nodded through at a board meeting? That's not what the board is there for. The board is there to hold you to account as the chair, the chief executive to account, and Police Scotland to account, and it's got to be done openly and transparently. And it seems to me that this clearly is indicating a lot of these discussions and decisions are being effectively made in private and nodded through in public, and the public don't see what's going on, see what the discussion is, or anything like that.
I don't think that's how it worked. A draft was circulated to the members' meeting, I believe, at the time. It was discussed, but decisions weren't made at that point. The decisions were made at the board meeting itself.
Through the board, clearly, I mean, my understanding is that there's a pre-meeting meeting before the board meetings. Is that right?
There's a very short meeting before the board actually starts.
So who's at the pre-meeting meeting?
The board members.
All board members?
Yes.
And is there a record of what's discussed at the pre-meeting?
No.
Why not?
It's only preparatory for the full meeting.
Why is there no record of it?
It's as I say, it's only preparatory. It's here's the agenda. Is there any comment on any of the papers that we have? Any short updates that there might have been since the papers were issued? So
what you're saying, Mr Flanagan, is that something as important as the governance arrangements for the SPA were discussed at a short pre-meeting meeting where there's no record taken, and then it went to the board after that discussion to be nodded through.
I don't think the governance arrangements were discussed at the pre-meeting.
Well, it says here, I now understand that the framework has been discussed in private session. So if it wasn't a pre-meeting private session, what private session was it?
Oh, John.
Perhaps I could come in to be helpful there, Mr Neil. My understanding of reading the content of the letter from Mr Penman is that the framework documentation and associated documents had been discussed in private session, which is a private members' meeting. There's a private members' meeting which takes place every month. And
the pre-meeting meeting?
Yes, this is in addition to a pre-meeting.
And when you say a private meeting of members, is that every board member?
Yes.
And is there a record of that?
Yes, yeah.
So where are the records then? Are they published?
The records aren't published for
Why
the,
are they not
for the
published?
members' meeting.
Why are they not published?
Well, we're never published.
Why are they not published?
Well, it's regarded as a meeting where members can speak freely about matters appropriate to the authority.
In other words, this is all done behind closed doors. The governance and the recommendations, and the First Minister has said the Scottish Police Authority has to take heed of the recommendations on governance, the comments on the review from the Chief Inspector and from the Auditor General. The First Minister has said that in Parliament, and you're having a private meeting with no public, no publication of the minutes or no public record of the meeting to discuss the very issue, the governance, the main recommendation of which is that it should be opened up, transparent and accountable, and you're going ahead with these meetings behind closed doors with no access, not even telling people that these meetings are taking place, and you call that open governance and transparency.
I have to say, Mr Neil, that those meetings where governance would have been discussed, the governance documentation was very much working draft at that point in time.
It doesn't matter. It should be discussed in open session.
There has to be an ability for people to get to a position where there's an acceptable governance document that's fit for purpose. Because we started off in the process a while back, and to try and explain it, if I can add some clarity, it may be helpful. The first draft of the governance documentation was probably about this thick, and we had to distill it down to get it into a proper document. So we had to have these discussions amongst the members and other people who were working on it to get to that point. That's the way these discussions operate.
Well, will you now publish the minutes of those private meetings?
I'd need to check that they're still available.
What? You'll need to check they're still available? For goodness sake, you're the Chief Executive. Surely you keep a record of every minute taken and every record of every meeting taken. Chair, have you still got your record of these private meetings?
I don't hold them, but they will exist.
They will exist?
Yeah.
So the Chief Executive says, I don't know if they still exist. And you as the chairman, although you don't hold them, you're saying they do still exist.
Well, I would expect
so
them
which
to
one
exist.
Is it? Who's right? Do they still exist?
There will be a record of them, yes.
You just said you didn't know.
What I said was I'd need to check if they're still available because they aren't published minutes, and so there could be elements of them that aren't there. I haven't checked. I've had no reason to check.
Can I suggest strongly, Convener, that this committee asked for a copy of every private session held in regard to governance and any other related matters that should be in the public domain, and that in future these private meetings should be opened up in public unless it's something of obvious import that requires a private meeting, such as a terrorist thing or something like that. But something as as open as governance, as basic as governance, being decided, all behind closed doors in a way that's going to be nodded through by the obviously compliant non-executive members of the SPA without saying a dicky bird about it. And we're all supposed to accept that as a good example of open, transparent governance. What are you doing about this, Paul?
So
you're not finding this acceptable, surely?
The committee are raising significant issues that I recognise need to be dealt with.
But why have you not dealt with them before now? Why have you allowed... Were you aware of these private meetings?
Well, I'm absolutely aware that there are a range of meetings...
Yes or no? Were you aware of the private meeting?
I am not aware of all of the private meetings that take place within the Scottish Police Authority.
Were you aware of this private meeting on governance?
No, I do
you
not.
Weren't aware of
I
that?
do not get a detailed account of every private meeting that is held by SPA members. I would, though, wish to put. I think it is very important that we recognise some of the history here around
we know the history.
around
it's been
governance.
Going on for 3 years.
Well, could I make reference, please, specifically to the governance review in policing that the Cabinet Secretary for Justice asked Andrew Flanagan to undertake shortly after he took office. That was then... So this review of governance is in the public domain, was published around a year ago, and contains 30 recommendations.
Well, we know all that. We know all that. I'm not interested. We know all that. That's history. What I want to know is the private meeting on governance. You didn't know it was taking place. Is that right?
Well, what I've said is I do not have an account of all of the private meetings.
Answer my specific question, Paul. Forget the civil service nonsense. Did you know the private meeting was taking place, referred to by Derek Penman in his letter? Did you know in advance that meeting was taking place?
No.
Did you have the paperwork for that in advance?
I do not receive paperwork for SPA
well,
private
did your colleagues
meetings.
Receive it?
Don may wish to comment on that.
We would have received the agenda for relevant SPA board meetings.
Well, is this a relevant SPA? Did you receive the agenda for this?
We would have received the agenda for all SPA board meetings.
Does that include these private sessions?
Generally, yes.
Did you get the papers for this private session referred to?
I think almost certainly we would have, yes.
Were you in attendance or any of your representatives in attendance?
No, we tend not to attend SPA board meetings.
Have you got a copy?
We have in the past, but we don't.
And you got a copy of the record of the meeting?
I don't recall ever seeing a minute of that private session of the meeting, but that doesn't mean it wasn't sent to Scottish Government at some point.
Right, OK. So we have this secret society inside the board, not even the full board, sometimes it would appear, inside Scottish Police Authority, deciding on transparency of governance, and the whole thing is done, without public knowledge, without people out there being able to hold this board to account, because this is all done deliberately behind closed doors, to undermine the very principles of transparency and accountability that the whole purpose of the review the Cabinet Secretary set up was designed to address. How is that excusable or defensible?
The discussions itself were actually on the detail of how we were going to implement the recommendations in the governance review.
It's of public interest.
I think it was at quite a detailed level. It didn't change the recommendations from the review itself, so those were what we actually proceeded to implement. So I'm not sure that it was necessary to discuss.
Well, if we look at the implementation, see the recommendations made by Derek Penman in his letter of the 9th of December. How many of those recommendations have been implemented?
Well, we've taken into account what he said and other stakeholders.
That's
as
not
well.
what I asked.
We've
I said how many have been implemented.
Been implemented.
They haven't been implemented.
No.
So when are they going to be implemented?
They're going to be taking account of the review of the governance arrangements that we scheduled for June this year to see how the existing arrangements were working, the ones that we put through in December, and we will take his account and his views as a central part of that discussion.
So this is the Chief Inspector who's just about, I believe, or may already have started now, his inspection of your governance arrangements. Yeah?
He's not started yet, no.
No, but he's due to start. Is that right?
Later in the year, yes.
Right. And you've had the First Minister, the Auditor General and the Chief Inspector tell you that the governance arrangements and certain aspects of the recommendations they do not find acceptable and need to be amended, and you're not going to consider those in effect at least until June this year?
I've had continuing discussions with the Chief Inspector, and we've agreed when he should schedule the work, what he should do in terms of the review that he says that he wants to conduct. And I think that is his view is that he would like to see our own review of the governance arrangements, taking into account all the evidence and all the views of stakeholders, being revised, being changed in the summer before he conducts that inspection.
So how do the board members know that when they don't have this letter of the 9th of December? Is the decisions all being made by you personally, Mr Flanagan?
No, I discuss these openly with the board members on a regular
But the
basis.
letter couldn't have been discussed openly because they never got the letter.
The contents of it were known to them and they were informed of it.
The contents were not known. They never got the letter. Did you tell them there was a letter?
Yes, and it was actually...
And no non-executive member asked for a copy of it?
No.
No board member has asked... Have you told them there was a letter? Did you tell them that at the board meeting in December?
I don't recall if
But
I
we
said
don't
it
recall.
at the December.
You know, the memory, there must be something wrong with memory around the SPA. Everybody seems to have a bad memory. So the fact of life is they didn't know about the existence of the letter that would appear at the board meeting in December, and even when they've been told, no non-executive member has asked for a copy of it. Is that right?
It was referenced in the Audit Scotland.
No, but
the existence of the letter was referenced in the Audit Scotland.
Nobody
report.
asked for a copy of it.
No.
That tells you a lot about the board of the SPA. Convener, I think it's quite obvious this is a shambles.
Thank you very much, Mr Neil.